This is a 100-meter Buddha statue, and this is a higasa. For those of you who don't know, this is a UV protecting umbrella, and it's something that if I was using this back in the UK, I would almost certainly get some weird looks. So the summer's finally started to creep in here in Japan, and it's stupidly hot and humid. And not only does this umbrella protect me from the UV, but it also cools me down by a few degrees too. If you was to go anywhere in Japan right now, you would definitely see flocks of people using these umbrellas. And while they're mainly used by women, it's starting to get more popular amongst men too. It took me a while to really get over my irrational fear of using one of these. Maybe it was because I was embarrassed, I'm not sure, but I definitely didn't regret it once I started using them. So come on guys, there's nothing de-emasculating about using a higasa. And in line with this, something that's really changed for me since living in Japan is skincare and beauty standards. Now let me explain. Now this isn't something that you necessarily have to live in Japan for, but if you watch my last video, you'll know that I was living with a Japanese family of 4 sisters for a few months, and I think in doing so, something just kind of rubbed off on me. And after waiting outside of the bathroom each night for hours on end for each of them to do their extensive skincare routine, only for me to go in there just to splash some water on my face, I think I slowly started realizing that I should probably take better care of my skin. And since then, I've adopted a pretty solid skincare routine. Japan also has very different beauty standards to the West. For example, having a small face is often seen as more desirable. And if you don't know what the difference is between a small and a big face, then don't worry, because neither do I. Another example is skin tone. I think it's commonly known that having pale skin in a country like Japan is often seen as more desirable, which goes back to my point about skincare and UV protection. It's quite a stark contrast compared to the West, where being pale is often seen as a sign of being sick and unhealthy. I think many women would rather drown in their own sweat here than be overly exposed to UV, whereas many people in the West often flock to the beaches in the summertime to catch a tan. The Japanese people really take UV protection seriously here. Even the other day, I was driving back from the onsen with a friend. We drove past this school and there was all these students that you could see them all putting on their sun cream and using the UV protecting umbrellas. And I think that this mentality kind of rubbed off on me naturally over time. So even now, I'm always making sure to use sun cream every day. And even though I work at home, I have UV blocking curtains installed in my apartment as well. I think it also makes a difference as well that Japanese sun cream is like leagues ahead of what you would find in the West. It's a really like different kind of sun cream. It's not sticky, it doesn't smell or anything like that. And it doesn't feel too heavy on your face. And a lot of the time it usually contains a lot of skincare ingredients as well, like hyaluronic acid, so you can have nice and shiny smooth skin like these fish. Also, prominent features such as a tall bridged nose are often seen as attractive in Japan, and I can speak from personal experience, having a somewhat large nose myself. I think it's likely due to the fact that these sort of features are somewhat rare in Japan, which leads them to be a bit more desirable. But I distinctly remember a few years back, I had a pretty strange experience when I was on the train on the way home, where a random lady tapped me on the shoulder just to tell me that she liked my nose and that she wanted to take it for herself. I presume that she was just expressing her envy and she wasn't literally saying that she wanted to cut my nose off and stick it on her own face. But nonetheless, I made sure to look over my shoulder all the way back home that night. There are many more examples of how the beauty standards differ, but I think the key lesson I take from this is that, you know, just because some people don't like apples, it doesn't mean that apples are inherently bad. And in the same way, we are all apples. And yeah, sure, there's plenty of people that don't like apples, but conversely, there's plenty of people in the world that absolutely love apples. Does that make sense? So the other day I went to Wan Wan Land, which is like a dog amusement park in Ibaraki Prefecture. You can hang out with the dogs, watch shows and other events, and worship the 11-meter wooden dog statue. And as I watched the toy poodles race around in some kind of semi-legal gambling event, I was reminded of how much I've come to enjoy the simpler things in life. Living in Japan has taught me to focus more on these joyful moments and less on divisive topics like politics and other controversial discussions. It seems like the West is more divided than ever before. People often associate as part of groups, which is human nature after all, but when it comes to these more controversial topics like politics, it does feel like sometimes we forget who we are. So when I first moved to Japan and I was trying to make friends here, I found it really difficult to get Japanese people to engage in such topics. But over time I realized it's not because of apathy or because they aren't interested, it's because steering clear of such topics is one of the biggest reasons why there is such a preservation of harmony in Japanese society. For example, young people rarely vote in Japan, and while this does have negative implications in itself, Japan as a whole is a much less fractured society than you might see in the West, and people tend to steer clear of any conversational topics where they think that they might offend the person that they're talking to. Over my time living in Japan, I came to realize that life is kind of too short to spend time focusing on the things that divide us, and I would rather spend my time just enjoying the simple things in life. Now, I know people might disagree with me, but these days I generally try to avoid watching the news too much and getting involved in politics, except for viewing it from a neutral spectator's perspective. Sure, I have opinions on the current situations around the world, but I think there's a balance, and I tend to just avoid bringing these up in conversations where possible. There's a few points that are spoken about a lot, like safety. But one point that I think strongly resonates with anyone that's lived in Japan or has even been here for a few weeks is awareness and respect for others and how your actions impact the people around you. I want to mention this one and give my own take on it because personally I think this one is the most impactful. So back in the UK, people are very friendly and polite, but when it comes to the nation as a whole, it does sometimes feel that people are largely just looking out for themselves. You'll get on the train and it'll be super loud, and most of the time you'll end up just having to listen to someone else's phone call conversation. Everywhere you go there's litter and trash, and in general it just feels like people aren't very considerate. This also extends to customer service in places like restaurants, which I feel has really dropped in the last few years. So the last time I went back, I went to the shop to get a SIM card for my phone to use just for 2 weeks, right? And I got to the shop and there was a guy behind the counter, and I went up to the counter and he was just sitting there on his phone like texting or something like that. And when I said, "Hey, excuse me," he just said, "Oh, wait a minute." So I had to wait for him to like finish texting on his phone, and then when he eventually decided that he wanted to talk to me, anytime I would ask him any questions about the SIM card, he would just like shrug his shoulders and I don't know. Now comparing this to Japan, I could probably go to any random restaurant anywhere in the country and I would likely get a similar level of service to some high-end restaurants in other countries. I think it's the small things, like staff will almost always preemptively refill your drink if they see that it's almost empty, just to avoid you having to go out of your way to ask them to do so. Japan is really one of the few places in the world where I would gladly give a tip, and the fact that you don't have to here is just absolutely insane. But this level of care extends far beyond just customer service and can really be seen in just about everything. I think there's too many examples to go through here, but anyone that's been to Japan will, tell you just how quiet the trains are or how clean the country is in general. But I just want to highlight one experience that really stuck with me. So when I quit my teaching job, on my last day, aside from all the neatly presented gifts from the other teachers and students, I was in the staff room getting ready to leave, and then suddenly the music teacher pulled a flute out and stood up and proceeded to play the British national anthem in front of me and the rest of the teachers. The fact that he just spent the time learning how to play it and then proceeded to play it in front of me, I think that's just something that really stuck with me and just encapsulates all of the really nice experiences that I've had over the years here. Over my time living in Japan, I've become very accustomed to such gestures of appreciation and just general awareness of how my actions impact the people around me, and this has really had a massive impact on me. But one thing that I will say is that Japanese people are just people at the end of the day, and while there's lots of commentary highlighting the Japanese for showing such characteristics, such as when you see Japanese people cleaning up the stadiums after sporting events, there's nothing stopping other countries from adopting such behavior. As unrealistic as it seems, it comes down to how we act as individuals. So I moved to Japan when I was 21, fresh out of university. I've spent most of my adult life here, so I think that shaped me in a unique way compared to if I had moved here later on in life. Because of this, there's definitely a loss of identity in the sense that I don't quite associate well with Japan because I'm not Japanese, obviously, and the same now goes for my own country in the UK, and I do kind of feel a bit out of place every time that I go back there. I often find it difficult to know which elements of my personality are influenced by my time living in Japan and which aren't, but there are definitely a few things that stand out to me as being clear lifestyle changes as a direct result of living in Japan. So the first one being onsens and saunas. When I first moved to Japan, the idea of getting into a bath surrounded by other naked men wasn't exactly high on my priority list of things that I wanted to do. There's a bit of a sauna boom going on right now in Japan, and onsens can be found in pretty much most major cities and towns that you go to, and most of the onsens do have a sauna as well. So a few years ago, a very good friend of mine got me into the whole sauna culture, and ever since then, all of my Friday nights now end in a sauna session. And it's during these moments, stripped of our clothes, sitting in a 95-degree wooden barrel, that my friends and I have our deepest conversations. I also want to touch a little bit on diet as well. Now, I like to think that my diet was relatively healthy before coming to Japan, but the main thing that's different for me now is that my palate has definitely changed. I think one major shift has been in my choice of beverages. These days, I'll only really drink water and unsweetened teas like green tea and oolong tea. Before I came to Japan, I was so used to drinking sweetened drinks, and even this is such a shock for me every time I go back now and I see people just ordering by default things like Coca-Cola or Pepsi whenever they go to restaurants. And to be honest, this change wasn't entirely intentional for me either. It's more so the case that anytime that you go to a restaurant in Japan, they'll usually just have water and tea as default just on the table that you could help yourself to. So over time, I just gradually got used to drinking this, and just after years of just drinking tea and water, my palate's completely changed, and now anytime I drink a sweetened drink, it just kind of feels a bit grim inside my mouth. Anyways, that's all from me. If you've visited Japan before, or if you've lived here and you've noticed any changes in your own behavior, then do let me know in the comments below.